I don't think we're going to be able to go outside on the swing and record the talking parts for some reason. Misha here, and did you realize that the M4 is actually the first official adopted AR-15 carbine in the U.S. military? Yes, there were things like the XM16A1, the GAU-5A, AA, but those were kind of experimental or COTS purchases or whatnot. The M4 came first. Also, the last time I was out at the cabin, I mentioned that I had a couple of projects. That's when I did all those revolver videos, because I had a couple of projects coming due, and they just weren't ready yet. And this is one of them. And it's ready for its test firing. And it's kind of a companion to a gun that you've seen on the channel more than once. Right here. What do these represent, and what are the exact guns? Well, this one that I've had for a number of years, actually I got it police surplus off CDNN a long time ago, is a Colt LE6320. Pretty uncommon variant. And I've used it in my collection for years as kind of my ersatz Blackhawk down carbine, Delta Force, essentially an M16A2 carbine. Peanut just joined us. Hello, girl. She's rubbing my leg. And it's quite close, but it's not 100% there because of what it is. We'll get there later. Indeed. But it is a factory gun. And by the way, M16A2 carbine, Colt designation, not US designation. This right here is what Colt called the M16A1 carbine. And what made me kind of really excited to do this, this is an authentic government military surplus 6.53 upper. And I have it on a replica Colt M16A1 lower, actually thanks to Chris Bartacci, got this lower from. And I even have a metal stock on it. Although, it does have the third position. I'll explain why. And this, of course, has the Fiberlight stock. And this has a Brownells replica Colt optic. Needed to put it on something. So let's today talk about the steps in between the XM177, the GAU-5A, and the adoption of the M4. Very small but very important contracts. And we're going to test fire my build here. See how it runs. And as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Like to help out, you can do a super thanks here on YouTube, or you can help out on Patreon. But if not, just liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. I mean, it's an AR, so I'm sure you've got comments. They help a lot too. With that, let's try this out for the very first time. Alright, just loaded up a few. Again, Phoenix. Here's an initial test run. Went in the battery. Okay, it even held open. Not bad considering the condition of some of these lower parts. A good start. But let's set the Colt 6320, the M16A2 carbine, aside for a minute, so we can talk about the A1 carbine and how and why this replaced the Commando, the CAR15, the whole family, what we have here, and just explain why I wanted this in my collection, because typically I go with martial guns, service guns. The Cliff Notes version of carbines in Vietnam, they were actually classed as submachine guns. The Colt Commando was the name, CAR15, the name that's been used forever. They did not have as many as you thought. The Navy SEALs tried out the Colt Model 607 as the GX5857. They just had a handful. The 605 was actually Colt's very first carbine. We did a video on that quite recently. You can check it out on the channel. The 608 never really came to be. The 609, the 610, that was the first one that got attention as the XM177 and XM177E1, forward assist or no forward assist. In 1966, the government purchased just over 2,800. It was purchased through the Army, but some would go to the Air Force and Navy SEALs. This was the biggest batch. These had the shorter 10-inch barrel, and they messed with the moderator. There you go. They were delivered, and then in 1967, another batch of just over 500. These were the Colt Model 629, 6920. This was the famous XM177E2. Today. That brass, the reason it does that, it's a feature. It was to throw Charlie off in the jungles. Held open.
I don't buy it.
Had an extended 11.5-inch barrel for better reliability, also to take an underbarrel grenade launcher, and it had the 4.3-inch moderator, meaning that once you put it on that barrel, you were 14, 15 inches regardless. It helped with sound, but there you go. In 1968, the government actually declined to purchase more of the XM177s, E1, E2, whatever. Should also mention this is where the Air Force GAU-5A and GAU-5AA come from. Essentially, their designations for the 10 and the 11.5-inch versions, respectively. But they said after testing, they really didn't want to purchase more in 68. There were plans to kind of ramp down the ground war in Vietnam. And, well, that 4.3-inch moderator, it was getting classed as a sound suppressor. Now, that stings for us, but it even stunk for Colt because the Gun Control Act in 1968 really put severe restrictions on the export of any kind of NFA-type items, including suppressors. So even though the government declined to buy more of the 11.5-inch carbines with moderators, Colt couldn't sell them overseas, which they kind of wanted to do. Thus, by 1970, they made the decision to just get rid of the 629, 630 forward assist, no forward assist. Yes, the no forward assist version is the 630. 649, something different. That's an error in an old Colt catalog that keeps getting repeated online. But, of course, Colt was going to replace the XM177E2. The 629 was something. And that's where the 653 and this gun today comes in to play. Alright, we will keep on. Ejection seems quite even. My safety is still a little stiff from the finish, but that should wear in. By 1973, maybe earlier, but by that time, this model was in the Colt catalog. Actually, it was a small family, the 651, 652, 653, 654. And at least by 1974, Colt was shipping these. But this was a commercial export product. Now, when I say commercial, I don't mean civilian. I mean military, security, police customers, because these were select fire, safe, semi-full auto. Now, of course, YouTube, this is a semi-automatic only receiver. It's just a replica. Now, they weren't marked with the numbers. Those are just catalog and, configuration things. They were simply marked M16A1, not Carbine, just M16A1. And since they were carbines, that's kind of where the name comes from. So we're kind of getting away from the old Commando name by this point. Although the name CAR15 would stick. In fact, every gun you've seen in this video will be technically a CAR15. That was the general term. Heck, even when I was getting into these late 90s, CAR15 was just kind of a catch-all, no matter the barrel length. And that really was the big difference. From the front sight rear, this was very similar to an XM177E2. There were a couple of differences we'll get to, but the big one that matters is they got rid of the 11.5-inch barrel with the 4.3-inch moderator. And they simply replaced it with a 14.5-inch barrel and a standard birdcage flashy hider. And they would keep the bayonet lug, and this would allow for attachment of like an M203 underbarrel launcher. It also gave more dwell time and, well, a little bit more accuracy, a little bit more velocity besides. And of course, with this longer barrel, they really hit upon what they've kind of wanted the whole time. But, you know, it seems logical in hindsight, but this fixed all the issues, at least most of them: reliability, range, accuracy, and noise. This barrel is the same volume, or even maybe slightly quieter than the one that has the quote-unquote suppressor, sound silencer, according to the ATF. Plus this one, you can do this. Attach bayonet. Kind of a happy coincidence, as this is the same length on the 20-inch from here to here. This is a Colt bayonet, although it was actually made in Germany by Korn for them. Let's see if it fits fine. No problem. Still used the same single heat shield 6-hole handguards. Still had the bottom mounted sling swivel. One small difference, and I don't know why, but this series went back to the straight slip ring. Yes, the earlier XMs, they had the Delta ring, which was a marked improvement. But with this series, they're back to it. The 6.53 had a forward assist. The 6.54 did not. And both of those had a retractable stock. It had the original style spanner wrench nut here. And it had a 2-position metal. Although this one does have a 3rd position, which is something that Delta Force, Rangers, other Special Forces units sometimes machined in, which makes good sense. Same A1 type port door. If you're wondering what the 6.51, 6.52s were, that was the same barrel and carbine handguard, but with a fixed A1 buttstock, which is kind of cool. If I had an A1 out here, I'd throw that lower on just to kind of give a replica, but I don't. Oh, and by this point, the 70s, yes, finally the 30-round mags are getting ubiquitous. The military actually wanted to get 7 of them with the original Commandos bought in 66, 67, but Colt just could not supply enough, so they were shipped with the 20s. A lot of guys would actually personally buy private purchase, or units would have COTS, commercial off-the-shelf purchases of mags in Vietnam. Pretty neat. In hindsight, we can say this is what the Colt carbine should have been all along, but it was a process. With the stock retracted, we are just under 30 inches, about 29.8, and fully out, we're at about 33, maybe slightly more inches, so saves a little bit of length there, about 3.5 inches all told. For what it's worth, the fixed stock version was slightly longer at about 33.5, 33.6 inches. As far as weight, just, you know, no sling, no mag, no nothing. This is a light gun, thanks to the original A1 field sights, slim handguard. Even the metal stock, it's alloy, doesn't add a whole lot of heft, and it still has the thin pencil barrel. Not much over 6 pounds, frankly. Throw in a loaded mag, and you're still just a hair under 7 pounds. So, cool little handy gun, at least until you start throwing all kinds of stuff on it. The lower is standard A1. Forward assist is a standard teardrop. It used the standard carbine buffer, not a later H1 or any of that. That's later thing. Standard carbine gas system. Standard A1 front sight. I should point out that by this point, the flashing would be left on the front sight base. Colt stopped machining these in the late 60s or very early 70s. It does have appropriate markings on the barrel. CMPB, so essentially Colt magnetic particle tested chrome line bore. This would still have had the original 1 in 12 twist for the 55 grain M193 round. Yeah, it really is just a shrunken down M16A1, and it still uses the A1 grip and everything else. This is built from surplus parts, like I said, the originals, except for the lower. Some might have refinished the upper, but you're kind of destroying some of the original. This gun, this upper at least, earned its wear and tear. Over time, I'm going to wear the lower as best I can to match it. But as we've seen, it seems to work just fine. It approves. Aside from being light and handy, why did I want this? Well, these were actually used quite extensively by the US government, but never officially adopted. Many of them were just COTS purchases done at the unit level, service level, although there were a few contracts more official in the 80s. The U.S. Army acquired some beginning in the 70s. These would go to things like Rangers, Scouts, eventually Delta would get some. We see these in use in 1983 in Grenada. We also see the Navy SEALs with some, including underbarrel 203 launchers in the 1980s. And the Air Force has an interesting relationship with the 653. Put a pin in that, and not the 654, the 653. We don't know how many saw service. Official contracts in the 80s, there's a handful. They add up to around 300 pieces, but smaller purchases and more unit level estimations are 800, maybe 1,000 were picked up to kind of supplement things. Keep in mind, it took a while for the M16A2 to come around. Keep in mind, there were pretty big budget cuts after Vietnam, so there wasn't really the desire or money to buy a whole new thing. But when Special Forces want and need something, they get it. Also, especially in the Air Force, military police and dog handlers and that stuff needed a lightweight gun. There are people that just need it, and it is shorter and even lighter than the M16A1. And it would take a while for the 62 grain cartridge to kind of come in, so these would kind of stick around until the 1990s in some instances. So limited military success in America. No official M designation, but still, we see them in pictures, 83, and then we see it in like 89 Panama and so on and so forth. And internationally, it was successful for Colt. Like I said, 68, Colt was no longer kind of allowed to export the XM177 Commando style because of the moderator, and without it, it just wasn't reliable. So they started working with these. And Israel had actually wanted some of the original Commandos and ended up getting this model, the 653. We don't know how many, but Israel got a lot of guns from Uncle Sugar. And this would actually lead to a lot of their domestic variants. They would recycle and cannibalize 653s and similar M16A1 rifles, turning them down. Yeah, there's some pretty cool homegrown Israeli IDF carbine variants. And actually, the Philippines, Alisco Tool, would get a license to make these over there. It was known as the RO653P, and these would be for both their army and police. I don't know exact production numbers, but yeah, Colt gave them a license to make these over there. And there are a few other small users. Malaysia's often brought up, usually Special Forces. Again, military spending was kind of in a weird place in the 70s. It got better in the 80s, but this was one of Colt's more popular items in their catalog. The fixed stock version, I don't think many people went for those. It was this model here, including with the forward assist. Let's see how well it does with a modern PMag. I haven't even tried to insert an empty one yet, so true live fire test. I didn't put too many in there. So yeah, works with the PMAG. I am actually super impressed with how well this thing is running first rattle out of the box. Sometimes when you combine used, well-worn parts with a new part and then have to throw, and I just use whatever lower bits I have literally found in the floor and in bags just to kind of throw lower together as quick as I can. But no, everything is working great. It's a very important step on the way to the M4, which, you know, we recovered a video earlier in the year about that. But now let's move over to the next step, the next phase. After the US and NATO go to the M855 cartridge, the 62 grain and 1 in 12 twist is swapped out for 1 in 7. Nope. I don't think we can go out and do anything, don't you? Using Phoenix ammo. Got the best brass case I can find for a reasonable price. And it did hold open. Quite a smooth, light shooter. This is pretty much a perfect 653 clone. Of course, it is just a clone. Ironically, the factory Colt gun here, the LE 6320, while I really do like it, is not a perfect M16A2 carbine clone, a row 723. But I'll point out the differences and, you know, why I'm okay with it versus trying to do an exact clone. Because we have to move into the era of the new cartridge. In 1985, the 723 replaced the 653, and at the very beginning, the only noteworthy difference was the switch from 1 in 12 to 1 in 7 twists for the new round. Over the next decade, more and more A2 features would creep into the design, mainly to do with the upper and the furniture. As far as I can tell, the lowers, as long as Colt was not using up just old parts, were the A2 lowers. They would keep on using the slim 6-hole handguard for quite some time, not really till the M4 came out. And in the beginning, these could even have the metal two-position stock, although I would say by the late 80s, certainly early 90s, you're going to see the fiber light. And of course, they would have the A2 flash hider and all that. And the 723 started off with essentially an A1 upper, featuring what Colt calls field sights, but have a forward assist, but some didn't even have a brass deflector. That's actually where the LE 6320 does a good job of representing the 723, because it has the common upper, sometimes called the M16A1 E1 upper, or the C7 for the Canadian upper, where you have a fixed carry handle, and you do have an A2 port door. You do have the brass deflector. You do have the newer round forward assist, but you still have the A1 style sights, which makes sense on a carbine. It does save weight, what have you. It's an interesting hybrid, but you can definitely find variations. Interestingly, by now they are using the Delta slip ring again, even though they still have the original handguard. And the lower, it does have the reinforcements of the A2 grips. And while some were sold with the burst trigger pack, at least the ones picked up by the U.S. Armed Forces seem to have the original M16A1 FCG with auto. You know, there's just a few rounds left in that bag of Phoenix, so let's put them through the 6320. Don't want it to feel left out. Really good ejection pattern. Yep, that was it. No, seriously, I've had excellent luck out of this ammo. It's not a BS thing. You've seen it a lot. It just, for me, it definitely works in the kinds of military type guns that I like and appreciate, and just doesn't seem to give any issues, and the price can't be beat, in my opinion. Should also mention that at this time the finish is getting darker and darker gray, almost a charcoal, and then we'll eventually get to the glossy black era. The barrel. It would remain a 14.5, just like the previous one, meaning the lengths are essentially the same, give or take a fraction of an inch, so under 30 inches with it in, little over maybe 33 with it out. Cool. Still standard buffer, all that good stuff. That said, during the 723's run, you would see the early stepped barrels, going away from the pencil to the heavier kind of A2 profile with early steps here, which would eventually transition into the M4 cut, which is slightly different than the early stepped cut, but we're really nitpicking. So technically you could say 3 different barrels showed up on the 723. Now, some would attribute the stepped barrel to the 727. Again, Colt didn't mark the guns, and, you know, operators, they didn't pay attention. I mean, it's more of a catalog thing. So the 723 and 727 really do run into each other. Although we can say the later 777 was kind of an export thing. This is all transitional stuff. And it had a pretty brief time in the catalog, about a decade before the M4 came and took everything over. But still a very important transitional step, and really laid the groundwork for what would become the M4. Delta Force is probably the most famous, widely recognized user. The Navy SEALs seem to have some too, some scouts, rangers, security forces, a little bit here and there. It does seem like at least as many, maybe slightly more of these are picked up, but they're, as far as I know, pretty much all COTS purchases. They're not really official. I don't think they even had an NSN. If they did, wasn't a big one. But you're looking at maybe 1,000, 1,200, maybe slightly more throughout the Army and Navy and whatnot. Basically, they just needed a carbine, and they didn't have one, so that's what they went with. These would first be seen alongside the older 653 in 1989 in Panama. And by 1990, 1991, Special Forces SOV units would be deploying with these in the Gulf. And very famously, these were used in Somalia, Mogadishu, then the whole Black Hawk Down thing happened. But right after that, the M4 would come along, and that would be when the M16A2 carbine, the 723, or 727 if you prefer, but it does seem like the Black Hawk 9 gun was a 723, it would start to sunset in America. I could pretend like I was using the optic. Shouldn't mind. It's a very gentle recoiling gun for how light it is. Now, I do want to say that I mentioned the different barrel profiles. Colt almost seems to have used these interchangeably by 1989, 1990, 1991, kind of whatever they had on hand. This was slightly heavier than the 653, about 6 1/4 pounds unloaded, no mag. If it had the pencil barrel, that would bump up to about 6 1/2 pounds if it had the heavier stepped or M4 barrel. And then, of course, you know, add a mag and ammo, you're adding just under a pound to it. and that's not counting any optics. And it was by this era we start to see some lights and lasers and optics attached, like the early Aimpoint 2000s. They can kind of appear on here. This optic on mine isn't really correct for that, but I had it. It's a retro one. I thought it was cool, and it looks good on the gun. And that kind of gets us to talking about the Colt LE6320 for just a minute, how it differs from the 723, but why I'm okay with it in my collection. So on this side you see the lightweight carbine markings, but since this is a relic from a thankfully bygone time, it also has the law enforcement restricted marks on this side. I know some collectors like to get those today, and I understand the purpose, but having lived through it, I'm kind of glad it's gone. And it's not just on the guns we had it back then, it was on the mags too, because if it was made after September of '94, it was, well, restricted, and they had to start marking them. You're probably familiar with the LE6520, the fixed carry handle A2 version of this. That's more common. This, though, the 6320, they only built about 300 of these around 2000, 2001 as a special law enforcement contract. And the difference is in the upper. This still has the field sights, but it still has the brass deflector. Again, kind of like a C7 type upper. That's the big difference here. Otherwise, A2 all the way, and it will have later features borrowed from the early M4 line. And it does have a non-restricted type barrel here that is 16 inches with an A2 flash hider. Interestingly, these had a 1-in-9 twist instead of 1-in-7. The whole reason that they went with 1-in-7 in the military was actually to stabilize things like tracers and other special rounds. If it had not been for that, if it was just ball rounds, they actually figured 1-in-9 was fine. And a lot of European militaries went with 1-in-9. Austria and Poland come to mind, but there were others. So it doesn't have exactly the right twist rate, but it does have a pencil barrel, and it does have a bayonet lug. However, if you try using it, you will quickly see how the barrel is too long. I mean, it will work, but it's just on here. It goes to show you, you wouldn't think 1.5 inches would make that big of a difference, but guys, as we all know, it really does. It is decidedly a lightweight carbine. And keeping on a Phoenix ammo because that's what I've got, and that's what I honestly like. It has enough power to cycle even bullpups, but it doesn't beat the tar out of you. Unfortunately, I can't really tell you how it groups, or even how this Brownell's optic looks. I can tell you ejections even. And she held open. No surprise out of a Colt from kind of the golden era. So it still had the CAR15 type slim handguards, although M4 ovular could be a thing too. Luckily, by this point, they're no longer doing the front pivot pin retained by a screw. But then we move to the stock, and this is where we see the biggest difference. This has the M4 style castle nut, and it actually has a 4-position tube. The 723 basically never had a 4-position tube. I'm never going to say never because it's Colt, but most of them had 2. Although, as we kind of talked about with this gun a minute ago, Special Forces would often make that intermediate 3rd position, which makes perfect sense. So I bet you a lot of the 723s got that as well. Now this one has a Fiberlight stock on it. Most you see have an M4, so there you go. Of course, it's very easy to swap it out. And some police even put fixed stocks on here, like, you know, just A2 stock. Easy enough to swap out, but I would say that's another area where this just doesn't quite match up. So the core of the gun, pretty good, but the barrel and the stock, I mean, they're correct for a 6.320, but not for a 7.23 or 7.27, a Black Hawk down pistol grip. But I will say, a lot of the Delta Force guns, even in '93, still had the pencil barrel. Colt kind of just threw them in, what have you. And again, there were export models. There was one for the UAE, which I kind of think of as the 7.27, but you know, not necessarily. And then the 7.77 came last in the 90s. It was basically the last export fixed carry handle gun, as far as I'm aware. It had a lot of M4 features. You just happen to have a fixed carry handle A2 style. I will also mention that the M4 feed ramps would change over time. The early 7.23s had no feed ramps virtually. Then you had kind of the early shallow style. Late ones could have the more aggressive M4 style. Let's try a different mag. That seemed clean.
Looks good.
So, gonna try a couple more, but preliminarily could just be a weak spring in that mag. These are the older 20 round mags, so yeah, I don't really know their history, frankly. Let's try another mag.
Clean.
Clean. And we'll try the 4th mag I brought today. Brass, the reason it does that, it's a feature. It was to throw Charlie off in the jungles. Held open.
I don't buy it.
And we'll try the 4th mag. And that is virtually our story. I brought this out to test fire it. It's doing very well. Again, the Army and Navy use these in limited numbers, especially special forces and security types. And then, of course, switched over to the A2 with the new projectile, which did bring a few new features. I'd say the brass deflector is the biggest one, the most important one. But we haven't really mentioned the Air Force in a minute. And there is very little evidence that they picked up any of the 7.23s. If so, just a tiny number. So what were they up to in the 1980s and 1990s? After all, they really didn't go over to the M4 until the 21st century, as we talked about in that recent deep dive video. Let's really stress it out and do the kind of 80s hip fire thing. If it'll run this way, it's good. Yeah, it's good. It's not even gonna let me do the last part of the video, the outro outside. Oh well. She's also not happy about the weather, are you? Yes. I know. Is it the weather or the fact that you haven't had my attentions fully for the last bit? Alright. Let's wrap it up because Peanut says to. The Air Force's infinitely confusing GAU-5A series. Not that one. That's the new Air Force survival gun, which is actually at least halfway appropriately named, because basically GAU would be a gun, aircraft, complete unit. But when the Air Force started acquiring carbines like the 610 and 630 in the 1960s, they didn't really have a gun category, a personal gun category. So they just kind of slapped it in, naming it the GAU-5A that had the 10-inch barrel, and then the GAU-5AA with the slash had the 11.5-inch. And those were common for a minute. And this started off as a Troy AA, but it looks kind of weird now, doesn't it? There's a reason for that. Following Vietnam, the Air Force's budget was severely curtailed, and they just didn't have the money or the desire to put a whole lot of stuff into personal guns. That matters a lot more to the infantry, to the Marines, than it does the Air Force. They just need guns for guard units, a few special forces, MPs, that kind of thing. So what they would do is they'd take their M16 rifles and refurbish them and rebuild them into carbines, getting parts, and they would reuse their GAU-5A and GAU-5AAs, rebuilding those. But by the late 70s, they actually did acquire a few 6.53s with the 14.5-inch barrel from Colt. Now this is interesting. It was the 6.53 with the forward assist. I could find no evidence that they picked up the 6.54 slick side. And they would buy a few of these. And they would kind of be the earliest version of what I've turned this gun into here. By the mid-80s, the GUU-5P starts to become a thing. Since it passed its test fire day, it gets a sling. Unfortunately, since I'm out of the cabinet, I don't have extras with me. I had to steal it off a different gun. Oh well. Now watch it not work. Just because I said it graduated. However, it did work. Instead of buying all new rifles or carbines for the new 1-7 twist, they would just rebarrel, or in some cases buy new uppers for their existing guns. And that's the GUU-5P. That's what I kind of did to this Troy. By this point, they added a miscellaneous gun category. That's the U replacing the A, because A was aircraft. And the P suffix means like personal, so hand portable. So that's where that comes from. A little less confusing, at least. And they started with the 6.53. In fact, quite a bit of evidence that the earliest GUU-5Ps could have been 6.53s simply with the 1-7 twist barrel. It's also possible they got some of the early 7.23s, which look very similar, but evidence is pretty scant there. And they would get new barrels or sometimes new uppers and go from there. Now, if there was just a new barrel, it would still maybe have a slick side from the original Air Force, like 604s and GAU-5As. What I did here is I took the 11.5-inch off, and I actually added a barrel I found from a Colt 6.520. I didn't take it off. It was already a strip barrel. It's actually a 1-7 twist, but it is a 16-incher. Fun fact, even though 14.5 I should say, was the norm, I found very small evidence that kind of private purchase or just small COTS purchases, there were a handful of 16-inch barrels that show up in the GUU-5P. There's really no rules. Basically, it was a carbine, so shorter barrel, and it had a retractable stock. This one's really stiff on this gun. I need to work that in a bit. The early ones were just the 2-position metal. Then by the 90s, it would go to the 2-position fiber light. But by the late 90s, you could see 2, 4. There's even reports of some 6-position tubes being used by the Air Force as they're rebuilding guns. They're using whatever parts they can. And as the M4 stock kind of comes around, you do see some M4 stocks on these guys. The GUU-5B. They can be pretty much anything you want because they were the true definition of a mix master, which makes cloning them a lot of fun. It saved the Air Force some money and gave their armors work to do, and they would keep on until 2002 when they would officially adopt the M4 carbine. And it would take them until about 2006 to transition away from the GAU-5P and go fully over to the M4, although I bet some still popped up for years to come, including some lowers that were all the way back with the earliest M16s the Air Force acquired. Heck, they were even marked AR-15s back in like 62, 63. Hey, waste not, want not, Air Force. I'm with you. That's a great attitude. But that's what I've kind of done here is just hodgepodged it with parts, including the Colt barrel and the M4 stock. I don't know, just having a little fun. I even had a chrome carrier in this for a while. But that's what the Air Force was up to. They did have some 6.53s. They might have picked up a few 7.23s. But instead of getting more from Colt, they pretty much just use them as inspiration. They also bought conversion parts and kits from Colt to reuse their things. So that's kind of how these things served in the Air Force. Let's try the middle position that Vickers and the other Delta guys seem to like for the stock. Yeah, got it open there. Still kind of giving this gun its final tests. Not bad. I mean, I'm not wearing body armor, but I could see you wear with the thick coat on. And of course, these didn't have the dreaded burst mode in military service, which is the right decision. My safety's still a little stiff from the Cerakote, but it's wearing in pretty good. Of course, today it's all M4 all the time, except the Army still keeps saying they're doing the M7, but I think everyone agrees, even them secretly deep down, that's a bad idea. But the Air Force and the Marines still going with it. And sorry I had to steal this one's sling, but the 653, the M16A1 carbine, earned a sling today. I've got plenty different ones at home. May even put an older style one on here. But no, it shot great. No failures at all, even holding open. That Phoenix ammo has just been really good to us. A lot better than the old steel-cased Wolf we used to do for testing. It's running whatever we really tried it in. So we'll keep on. And I have had trouble out of this one in the past with steel-cased ammo. Let's have some fun. Heat up that light barrel real good. Anywho, in the collection, this represents the M16A2 carbine. And this is now the M16A1 carbine. And while only a few thousand total of these were used for 2 decades, they led the way. Keep in mind they only had a little over 500 XM177E2s and under 3,000 of the earlier ones. So they've always been small number guns until the M4 came along. But I think these definitely occupy a place in history. And I'm going to be honest, they're just fun to shoot. They're so lightweight, reliable, simple. Keep it simple, stupid in a good way. The stock actually fits nice and tight on this one, even though it's a metal stock. It doesn't have a ton of play for what these usually do. Trigger is a mil-spec trigger. I'm really happy I found this upper. And as I said, I wanted to share this gun with you last time, but the lower wasn't quite ready yet. So this time, in the rain, it is. So, hope you enjoyed that. This is kind of a good bridge video in between the M4A1 I did earlier and the M16A2 A4 I did shortly after that. You can add this to the list. Let me know what's your favorite configuration. Do you like the Vietnam XM177? Do you like the M16A1 carbine, M16A2 carbine, pre-M4 type? Maybe you like the M4, or heck, maybe you like Mixmasters and you like the Air Force's take on things, let me know. And Peanut too. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Like to help support us. You know the deal by now, but you know I also have to say it. You can do a super thanks. Commenting also helps a lot on YouTube. And you can always visit Patreon. With that, this is Misha. On behalf of Peanut, who is kind of absolutely ready for me to be done with this. We'll catch you very soon. Hopefully not in the rain next time.